Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For those here in-house, we would ask you to check that mobile devices have been silenced or turned off as a courtesy to our presenters. And, of course, for those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Leading our discussion today is Emily Cow. She is director of our Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society. As an attorney, she has defended religious freedom for the last 14 years. She has worked on behalf of victims of religious freedom violations in East Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and South Asia at the State Department's Office of International Freedom, as well as at the Juice Coggin Law Firm and Beckett Law. She has also taught international human rights law at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School as an adjunct law professor. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Emily Cow. Emily?
Thank you, John. Welcome to Heritage. We're so glad you're here for this important discussion today. All Americans benefit when our public discourse is civil. And this is especially true on sensitive issues. Today, there's few more sensitive issues than the issue of racism. And yet the left has persistently made the spurious comparison between people who believe that marriage is between a man and a woman and racists. Nothing could be further from the truth. This December, the Supreme Court will examine this issue when they hear the case Masterpiece Cakeshop, the case of Jack Phillips, a Christian baker from Colorado. Jack welcomes and serves everyone who comes into his store. He can't create custom cakes, though, for every event, and he can't celebrate every message. He would have gladly sold anything off the shelf to the same-sex couple who came to his store. But when they asked him to design a custom wedding cake for their ceremony, he politely declined. He couldn't express that particular message for the same reason that he can't express messages about divorce and bachelor parties, because his conscience won't allow him to create cakes for those events. So how is Jack's decision different from the decisions made by motel owners or restaurant owners who denied African Americans entry into their establishments in the Jim Crow South? First, Jack has never turned anyone away from his store because of who they are. And second, he's never denied anyone material goods or services that are essential to them. Jack serves everyone, but like many artists, there are some messages that he can't endorse and some events he cannot participate in because of his conscience. Nevertheless, a Colorado state official compared Jack to a Nazi and to a racist. Jack's situation raises larger questions about our society. Are we going to be a society that can openly and genuinely discuss controversial issues and disagree without one side demonizing the other? And if we carelessly use words like bigotry and make comparisons to racist, does that actually risk trivializing the real evil and the real harms of racial supremacy? Today, our panel will explore these important questions and discuss how we can elevate our public discourse. Chief Kelvin Cochran has been tearing down racial barriers for several decades. He was the nation's top fire safety official after President Obama appointed him to that position. Before that, he was the first African-American fire chief in Shreveport, Louisiana. He also led the Shreveport, Louisiana. He also led the Atlanta Fire Department until the mayor fired him from his position because of his religious beliefs. He is joined today by Kelly Fedoric, who is an attorney with Alliance Defending Freedom, our co-host for today's event. Ryan Baumberger is a creative professional who leads the Radiance Foundation with his wife, Bethany. It's a multimedia production company that produces life-affirming messages. He is one of 10 adopted children in a multiracial family and the father of his own biological and adopted children. Ryan Anderson is the William E. Simon Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He is a prolific author who writes on life, marriage, religious liberty, and philosophy. He's the author of several books, including Debating Religious Liberty and Discrimination with Sharif Girgis and John Corvino. He also wrote an amicus brief, in this case, Masterpiece Cakeshop, on behalf of several African-American civil rights leaders and religious leaders. And finally, our moderator is Jonathan Alexander. He's the Director of Public Policy at Liberty Counsel and Liberty Counsel Action. He has advised policymakers at the federal level and the state level on how to protect our constitutional freedoms. Please join me in welcoming them today.
As Emily stated, I'm thrilled to moderate this panel to explore more deeply whether the comparison of the racists who perpetrated the plight of Black Americans from slavery through the Jim Crow era, if that comparison is natural to make to those Americans of goodwill who can't create custom work to celebrate same-sex marriage, if that's a fair comparison, or if it's intellectually dishonest, if it shames the legacy of the African American victims of racism. You know, each one of these stories matter. Chief Cochran, one of my most cherished memories of this past year was sitting down with you one-on-one as you shared your story and the character that had developed you into the man, the husband, and the father that you are. Can you share that story, the story that began in Shreveport, Louisiana?
Yes, thank you. My story began actually when I was born in 1960 during the height of the Civil Rights Movement. Even at Confederate Memorial Hospital, the hospital where families who couldn't afford health care insurance went to have their needs met. I was born into a family with 6 kids. My mother was single because my dad left her for another woman. He was an alcoholic. And we grew up in significant poverty in Shreveport, Louisiana. And it was at 5 years old in 1965 where there were things that really impacted my life at that time that shaped my future. I realized that poverty was awful. You know, being on welfare and food stamps was awful. My big brothers were on the free lunch program at school. We had a lot of food at the beginning of the month, but at the end of the month, most of the food was gone most of the time. And we ended up eating mayonnaise sandwiches and drinking sugar water until the next food stamps came. I realized that not having a dad in our house was awful. It was hard on my mother, raising 6 children all by herself. She never remarried. And it was also in that alley at 5 years old. There was a fire across the street from where we lived, and seeing those Shreveport firefighters that day started a conviction in me that that's the day that I had the desire to be a firefighter when I grew up. So the grown-ups in those days taught us that all of our dreams would come true in America if we believed in and had faith in God, if we went to school to get a good education, that if we would respect grown-ups and treat other children like we wanted to be treated, they said that all of your dreams are going to come true. And I just believed that they were telling me the truth. And they raised us on faith and patriotism. And it's faith and patriotism that ultimately caused my childhood dream to come true in 1981.
What was it like being a firefighter in Louisiana?
It was a joy to become a firefighter, but at the same time, it was very challenging. While my childhood dream came true, I was one of the first African Americans to become a firefighter in the city of Shreveport, and we were not welcomed. The Shreveport Fire Department, like most fire departments in that time, were predominantly white males, and they did not want African Americans to be firefighters. You actually lived together for 24 hours, and you shared very intimate spaces. So There was a bed that was designated for the black firefighters because white firefighters didn't want to sleep on the same bed as a black firefighter for fear that they may contract something or get something that a black firefighter had. In some fire stations, there were designated plates, forks, and spoons to eat from, again, from a fear that a black firefighter would have something that a white firefighter may contract.
So you had faced many obstacles because of your race as a
Yes.
firefighter. How do you think you overcame those obstacles?
Well, it really goes back to a couple of things. I think the faith that was instilled in me growing up from my mother was a major issue, staying focused on that. And then I had this tremendous drive and determination that my compassion and commitment to serve our community as a firefighter was, if I demonstrated it consistently over a period of time, that I would win them over and that they would one day see me as an equal. So it was the drive and determination of faith and the drive and determination to prove that I had, through loyalty and competence, I could do the job just as well as they can do it.
Thank you. And your story continues. We'll get back to that in a bit. I just want to ask Mr. Baumberger a question. You have a unique insight on the issue of race here in America. You have a unique insight into the topic of interracial marriage. What are your thoughts on the often stated comparison of the ban on interracial marriage? What was the source of this ban? Is this ban the same as someone like Jack Phillips not participating in religious ceremony that violates his religious beliefs?
Well, I can say quite simply, it's not the same at all. In fact, I would say the comparison of same-sex marriage to interracial marriage, there really is none. I mean, the bans on interracial marriage, anti-miscegenation laws, which began in colonial America. In fact, 1691, Virginia was the first state to actually ban all interracial marriages. And my home state, which is Pennsylvania, I believe that they had, during the 1700s, 1720, somewhere around there, they had also enacted theirs, but then they repealed it in 1780. But the whole point of banning interracial marriage was simply just, as Ryan often says, is to sustain white supremacy, but it had nothing to do with what marriage was. My marriage to my wife, who happens to be Greek and Italian, we're different races, I have to put that in quotes, we're still male and female, and we still fulfill what the point of marriage is. So it's not the same. The other difference is, too, as a brown individual, I don't have to come out of the closet. You can tell that I'm brown. Am I right? You can pretty much tell that I'm brown. And so there are differences, particularly when you have leading researchers on the other side, like Lisa Diamond, who's a professor of psychology and gender studies at the University of Utah, in her 2016 peer-reviewed journal, where she talks about, the title of it is Scrutinizing Immutability. And in that, she draws the conclusion that sexual orientation is fluid. My pigmentation is not fluid. It never has been, except for, going out in the sun, I get a little tanner, but that's about it. But there's nothing that is changeable about this immutable characteristic. So that's why I reject the comparisons. The other reason why I reject it is because it is constantly the attempt of the LGBT movement to co-opt what I consider the blood-bought civil rights of Black Americans. LGBT individuals, and I'm not condemning individuals at all. In fact, this whole thing is not about stripping anybody of dignity. It's about actually giving dignity to everybody, allowing freedom for everyone. But the LGBT movement that co-opts the Black civil rights movement has to understand that there is a stark contrast. LGBT individuals were never enslaved. They never had separate and unequal schools. They never had to pay poll taxes. They never had to take these ridiculous literacy tests. They were never denied the right to vote, denied the right to sit anywhere on the bus. They were never given different movie theaters that they had to sit in or in the balcony of a movie theater. They never had to go to certain parts of a restaurant. They never had to face the inexplicable and violent racial discrimination. And so when they try to compare the LGBT plight with the civil rights fight here in America, I do reject it outright. There is a way to extend dignity to all, but if we don't focus on preserving our actual constitutional rights, then there is dignity for no one.
Thank you. Ryan Anderson, can you refine that for us. This Jim Crow government-sanctioned opposition to interracial marriage, it was part of this larger racist system. Can you refine that and why that is different or if there is any relevance to traditional marriage? Why is that comparison false?
Sure. I agree with everything that the other Ryan just said. So let me say a couple of other words about that. The bans on interracial marriage are unique to colonial America. In the common law tradition, in all prior world history, the race of the individuals was never taken into consideration when a marriage was taking place. So you've got the Old Testament, look at the New Testament, look at ancient Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, Roman philosophers like Cicero and Musonius Rufus, look at Catholic theologians, Augustine and Aquinas, Protestant theologians, Luther, Calvin, Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and Immanuel Kant. And they all think marriage needs to be colorblind, but none of them think it can be blind with respect to the sex of the individuals. All of them thought marriage required both a man and a woman. None of them thought ethnic, racial, or skin color identity had any bearing on what marriage is. It's only after people start enslaving other people on the basis of their race that they recognize interracial marriages, which are possible, need to be prohibited. No one was thinking on some deep reflection about what the nature of marriage is, that interracial marriage is impossible. They precisely understood that it was possible, but they wanted to prevent it from happening, because if you have interracial marriages, you'll have interracial children, and very quickly a system of race-based slavery and race-based white supremacy would unravel. This would come to an end, and so they interject something into marriage which is irrelevant, racial identity, and they ban certain types of marriage on that basis. This is then part of a larger system of white supremacy. Africans were enslaved for several hundred years in this country. After the abolition of slavery, we then had about 100 years of race-based segregation, which if you had the wrong color skin, you couldn't drink out of a certain water fountain or use a certain bathroom for fear of contamination. You couldn't attend an amusement park or a movie theater or a restaurant. Or if you could, you had to sit in a special section, the balcony or the back of the restaurant, the back of the bus. All of these things are part of a system of treating blacks first as second-class human beings. They were viewed as property, as slaves, and then as second-class citizens. And the bans on interracial marriage were part of this. So when the Supreme Court struck down bans on interracial marriage, they didn't say anything about the decent and honorable premises that support bans on interracial marriage. They didn't say anything about the reasonable people of goodwill that support bans on interracial marriage. And that's the exact opposite of what happened in the case of Obergefell. The Supreme Court recognizes that all of human history, all throughout human history, all across the globe, everyone has recognized marriage as the union of male and female. The Supreme Court says that even as they are going to redefine marriage in this country, they recognize that decent and honorable philosophical and theological premises are what inspire support for conjugal marriage, and that they're held by reasonable people of goodwill both here and throughout the world. Nothing like that could have been said, which is why nothing like that was said in the Loving v. Virginia case, where the Supreme Court struck down the bans on interracial marriage, because there weren't decent and honorable philosophical and theological premises that were behind that. They weren't held in good faith by reasonable people of goodwill. This was part of a larger system of subjugating a certain class of people based upon their race to a second-class status.
No, Chief, I know your experiences have inspired you when you rose to ascent to become the fire chief of Atlanta. It inspired you to create an ism-free environment. What was that? And can you tell us if that was implemented elsewhere, and ultimately your efforts to serve all people and save lives, how even that didn't go unnoticed, and your experience with President Obama contacting you? Can you just continue to paint the picture of your story?
Well, because I was raised by a faithful Christian woman who taught us to value all people and to love all people. After what I experienced with the city of Shreveport, I had made a vow that were I ever in a position of authority, I would have a responsibility as an American and as a Christian to create an atmosphere where no one experienced what I had experienced. And ultimately, it culminated in the city of Atlanta of what we refer to as an ism-free core value. One of our core values was ism-free. And it was a collaboration of all people groups of our department who listed our core values. It came down to ism-free because the men and women of the department said we should have an atmosphere that was absent of racism, favoritism, nepotism, territorialism, cronyism, a lot of isms that were negative influences on our culture. And they wanted all of their isms to be on our list of core values. And I said, it's too many, it needs to only be about 6. And so since we didn't want to discriminate against anyone's ism, we just decided that we would call it ism-free. And that is that we all had an obligation to create a culture where everyone looked forward to coming to work, and there were no barriers that hindered them from giving the very best they had to offer every single day. And so that was what we did. And I was able to do that not only in Atlanta, even though we coined the phrase ism-free, it was done in Shreveport, and it was also an initiative when I served as the United States Fire Administrator. And it was that part of the question where I was blessed and privileged, even though I came from a single-parent home of an African-American family who was raised on food stamps and welfare, which in our country is called an at-risk family. Through faith and patriotism, I achieved the highest office in my profession as the United States Fire Administrator. And to be appointed by the first African-American president of the United States to the highest office in my profession is just a testament to the value of the Constitution of the United States and a citizen living out those values throughout their lives, and the hope that we have in our religion, mine is in Christianity and in Christ, to where those two things, faith and patriotism, are really foundational to living out the American dream.
Absolutely. And this disparate treatment that you mentioned at the African American experience, I'll just ask Ryan Baumberger, what is considered the badges of slavery still continue through today? How would a private organization, a culture, or even a government right the wrong that was done to African Americans?
Well, that's quite complicated. Sometimes the government just needs to step out of the way. And in this case, you have the government forcing Americans to do something against their rights of conscience. I mean, the government can do things like help foster constructive dialogue. They can avoid passing social policies that damage Americans, like what is being attempted here with Jack Phillips. I mean, it's not the government's role. Contrary to, I remember reading the opinion of Bergefell, Justice Kennedy talked about conferring dignity upon people. It's not the role of a judge. You don't confer dignity upon people. So I think the government needs to stop trying to place value or to define the value of human beings, because that's way above their pay grade. So, and what the government can do, I think sometimes definitely needs to step out of the way, but they also need to understand they made an oath. I mean, our politicians made an oath to uphold the Constitution. And in the case of Jack Phillips and Barronelle Stutzman, and in the case of Chief Cochran, we have clear abuses of our Constitution. So I think their role really should be uphold what already exists and not allow some of the emotional games of semantics to get in the way. And I think too often that's what the American public has done, is we've allowed a lot of the, if you will, a lot of the hashtags to influence us away from what are actual constitutional rights. And, freedom of expression, free speech, freedom of association, religious liberty, which is often forgotten. But in my estimation, we have a government that too often ignores why they exist.
Right.
And I think stepping out of the way enables us to be a freer people.
Just ask Ryan Anderson, is there a time where government should say that certain races should be treated equal? Regarding the disparate treatment of African Americans, what was the appropriateness of public accommodation laws? Then contrast that to those same laws being used to demonstrate the examples that Ryan Baumberger just mentioned.
Yeah, so ordinarily in the U.S. context, we have a presumption of liberty. So we say that free association, free contract, freedom of speech, free exercise of religion, those are the presumption, but sometimes the state can override that presumption of freedom. And so in the case of the Civil Rights Act of '64 and of other public accommodation laws, what we saw was that people were abusing their freedom. We had racist business owners who were abusing that freedom of association and contract and speech and various other freedoms to exclude African Americans from their hotel chains, from their mechanic sites, from their restaurants, from their lunch counters. And the state said this isn't just causing dignitary harm, although it was causing dignitary harm, it was also causing material harms. African Americans were locked out of certain professions. Law firms wouldn't hire African Americans. The Ivy League wouldn't admit African Americans. You had certain, if your car broke down, it was unclear if you were black if you could find a mechanic to repair it and a hotel to rent you a room. And so there were material harms that were being perpetrated by the abuse of these freedoms. And so the state had a legitimate role in stepping in and saying you can't discriminate on the basis of race. And those laws were used as shields. They were used as shields to protect African Americans from the harm that pervasive, entrenched, systematic discrimination was causing in their lives. Right now, we're seeing that they've added the phrase SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity, to those laws, and they are now being used as swords, not as shields. They're being used as swords to persecute people like Chief Cochran and people like Jack Phillips, the baker in the Supreme Court case this term, like Barronelle Stutzman, people who serve all of their customers. Jack Phillips made it very clear that he would sell any other item to the same-sex couple that would come into his store that day, but that he couldn't do a custom same-sex wedding cake. And so this anti-discrimination law, it's not being used as a shield to protect the same-sex couple. It's being used as a sword to impose a sexual orthodoxy on the entire nation by imposing that sexual orthodoxy on Jack Phillips. As far as we know, Masterpiece Cakeshop is the only bakery in the entire state of Colorado that has turned down a request to do a same-sex wedding cake. So it's not like the Deep South during racism, during Jim Crow, where you had people locked out of entire markets. Here, as far as we know, there's the one baker in the entire state who has a conscientious objection to same-sex wedding cakes. It's unclear what the justification is for the government to say he has to bake this cake. And I would say that's one of the main differences. Is the law being used as a shield to protect people or as a sword to punish people?
Absolutely. And Chief Cochran, your story sort of demonstrates that. A sword used against you by the government dictating views on marriage. That came to your doorstep in 2014. Can you share with that?
Yes, it was the week of Thanksgiving 2014 where a book that I had written a year prior for a Christian Men Bible study, where I mentioned on a few paragraphs what the Bible says about holy matrimony, that marriage is to be between a man and a woman, that was brought to the attention of an openly gay Atlanta City Council member. The council member was offended about what I wrote about what the Bible says about marriage and sexuality, and complained to the mayor of the city of Atlanta. I was suspended for 30 days without pay so that the city could investigate whether or not my biblical views on marriage and sexuality caused me to discriminate against anyone within the department or in the community on that basis. Over the 30 days, the investigation concluded after talking to LGBT individuals that I had never discriminated against anyone in the community or within the department or any other type of discrimination. However, subsequently, I was terminated from employment after 34 years of faithful service on that basis.
Wow. And then that was you just writing a book for your Bible study.
Yes, I mean, it was away from work, had nothing to do with work, on my own time, and it was self-published with my own funds. The challenge for me as an American in that regard is the same faith and the same patriotism, the same Constitution that had caused me to have such a wonderful life and career now abruptly and suddenly, and what I mean by that, ladies and gentlemen, is I didn't even see it coming. It never crossed my mind that in the United States of America, the same faith and the same Constitution, the same living it out through patriotism that caused me to have such a wonderful life and career has now cost me my career. And that's the biggest challenge associated with this conversation today. That not only are you challenged for believing what has been believed in your life and for decades by many nations and nationalities, there are consequences, adverse consequences for publicly stating that, and that trend is increasing.
And that,
I'll just add on to that and say I think it's interesting and worth noting that he wasn't fired for something that he did. He was fired for something, for a belief that he held, and he was fired by the same mayor of Atlanta who actually recruited him 5 years previously to come back from being in D.C., serving as the highest-ranking fire official in the country, to come back and serve as the fire chief of Atlanta, had just received an award a couple months before for great service. So the same mayor who had asked him to come back decided that because of something he believed, that he was no longer worthy to hold public office.
so this idea of your belief in your vocation can even penetrate your creative arts. And I'll just ask Ryan Baumberger, can you shed some light into the process of being a creative professional? We do want to tie this into the Jack Phillips case. And why does creative professionals like Jack Phillips, why are they now being told by the government that they must lend their talents to promote something they don't believe? Tell us what it's like to go through the process of a creative professional and why Jack Phillips couldn't compromise in that area.
Right. Well, I don't know if you've noticed, but creative people can be passionate, emotional, internalize way too much. But there's a reason for the output, and that's because you are so particularly moved by something. And so as a creative, you want to create something that is part of your heart. And so when someone comes along and says, you know what, I know you believe this, and I know that this is your sort of angle, but you really need to create this. Not a whole lot of artists would go along with that, and I certainly wouldn't as a creative professional who's worked with ad agencies for years. In fact, ad agencies all the time decide which clients they're going to serve and which messages they're going to create. And as a creative director, you do that all the time. I can imagine, it's almost like a music company having to sign every artist or every band that came to them. You just don't do that. You know, telling Beyonce where she has to perform, or Bruce Springsteen where he has to perform, and which songs they have to do, which songs they have to write. It just doesn't exist. But for some reason in this context, with cake artists, with floral designers, with painters, they're being told, yes, you must create this particular message. And that's terrifying for me as a creative professional, because when my right to choose which messages I'm going to create and how I'm going to create them is dictated by a government, then there is no freedom. And so that's why I support Justice for Jack, because Justice for Jack literally is justice for all of us. And so as a creative professional, I don't want someone to say, you must create this, because I have to go back to my First Amendment rights. I have that freedom of expression. And when a government starts to dictate what that expression must be and where it must be expressed, then I no longer have my First Amendment rights.
If the Supreme Court were to render a decision down in favor of Jack, I'll just ask Ryan Anderson this question. What should be the response? If there is, in fact, justice for Jack, do LGBT people have a reason to fear?
The short answer is no. If the Supreme Court was to rule in favor of Jack, it would take nothing away from anyone. It would simply say that we can peacefully coexist, even while we disagree about the nature of marriage. So you can be in favor of gay marriage and also be in favor of Jack's freedom not to have to violate his beliefs about marriage. And the best kind of analogy to this, I think, is with what we've done, both the Supreme Court and Congress and many state legislatures after Roe v. Wade. The Supreme Court in 1973 created a constitutional right for a woman to choose to have an abortion. But Congress and the court have recognized a right for pro-life medical professionals not to have to perform an abortion, or for pro-life citizens to have to pay for an abortion. And so we've been able to simultaneously agree to disagree about abortion, where you even have pro-choice people saying, I'm pro-choice on abortion, but I don't think this pro-life doctor should be forced to perform an abortion, or this pro-life business should be forced to pay for abortion. Can we find that sort of a compromise here, where even while we continue to disagree about the nature of marriage, we don't force people like Jack Phillips to violate his beliefs. If the Supreme Court was to come to that conclusion, I think that's something all of us should be able to cheer. And there's nothing to fear if that's the outcome.
As we come to a close, I just want to give each panelist the opportunity to give some parting words. So if there's anything that our audience remembers, if there's nothing else that they remember, would be this final quote or statement. Ryan Baumberger, I'll just come to you first. You're an excellent communicator. How do you think we should be talking about this case? How should we be engaging others surrounding the Jack Phillips case?
Well, quite simply, I don't think quite simply applies here, actually. Scrap that. There's nothing simple about this because messaging is everything, and the other side has some very powerful messaging. We can't be afraid to speak the truth. And in speaking the truth, it's not hate. In fact, one of the things I talk about is we do through the Radiance Foundations, we try to fight factophobia, because truth ain't hate. And yet you're constantly being called a hater, you're constantly being called a bigot, but we have to be willing to speak the truth. I think if I had to distill it down to something that could fit on a meme, I would say loving every human being is not the same as loving every human doing. And in this case, particularly when hate is thrown around so recklessly, we have to be willing to speak the truth. Speak the truth about science. Unfortunately, the other side doesn't want to talk about science, and you can't avoid talking about science when you make these kinds of determinations. We have to be willing to speak openly about these facts, and also to have the civil kind of discourse, because I think too often the other side wants that kind of friction, wants to see, this manifestation of hate, and it's just not there. That's not what we're communicating. So communicate the truth in love. Don't be afraid to touch on the statistics surrounding a lot of these issues and to share the stories. We have to be willing to share the stories. I think ADF has done a great job in capturing Chief Cochran's story, in Jack Phillips and Baron L. Stutzman. Be willing to share it on social media. But we can't be afraid to engage in these conversations, or the other side owns the narrative.
Ryan Anderson, I'll sort of ask you the same question. How should we be engaging others on this issue?
Sure. I think what's most important here is to two separate arguments. One is that this is the type of issue on which Americans can agree to disagree. There are certain issues that we can't agree to disagree. This is one where we can, and that there's no reason why the state should be forcing Jack Phillips to violate his beliefs about marriage. There's no justification for the government to impose a sexual orthodoxy on the entire nation and then to coerce people against their conscience to endorse that orthodoxy, regardless of what you think on the underlying issue, that you can be in favor of gay marriage and be in favor of Jack's freedom. What to highlight here is that not every disagreement is discrimination. We should call out real discrimination, we should call out real bigotry, but support for marriage as the union of a man and a woman isn't discriminatory and it's not bigotry, and we shouldn't let the law say otherwise. Which leads to the second point, is that I think people like me who agree with Jack about what he believes about marriage, we need to do a better job at explaining why we believe what we believe about marriage. If we allow other people to speak on our behalf who don't do a particularly good job at this, if people begin to believe that the only reason that could motivate someone who believes marriage is a union of a man and a woman is animus and hatred and bigotry, then that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. We have to be able to explain to other people why it is we believe what we believe about marriage.
Absolutely. Chief Cochran, you've faced many triumphs over your life, but also many trials as well, both personally and professionally, suffered significant discrimination. What parting words would you like to leave with the audience today about how we should be thinking and even framing these important issues?
My life story is, I think, a testimony to the American dream. When I think about being born black in America, following generations of institutionalized discrimination and racism, in 1960, being born in 1965, having a dream about a future family, being a husband and father, providing for my kids without government support, being a firefighter and not being poor. Those dreams came to fruition because of faith and patriotism, which really drove and was the motive behind the civil rights movement. At the time my dream was born, African Americans could not be firefighters, but no grown person, no African-American adult ever told me to change my mind, to pick something else. They told me that in America, your dreams are going to come true if you believe in God, if you respect grown people, get an education, and treat other kids like you want to be treated. All Americans deserve the hope provided through the Constitution of the United States of America. Those Americans who choose a faith and who believe that their faith coupled with the Constitution is the ticket to their dreams coming true, have a right to live and hang on those hopes. If the conversation continues to go in the direction that it is currently going, whereby, as one elected official in Atlanta said, because I have expressed publicly my views about marriage between a man and a woman and biblical sexuality, I am no longer fit for public office. What that means is children in the United States of America who have that same belief, who want to be a firefighter when they grow up, who don't want to be poor when they grew up, you can cancel that dream because you may have everything else right, but if you publicly disclose your belief in marriage as being between a man and a woman, then you're not fit for not just a firefighter public office, but any public office. And I don't believe any American, no matter what side of the debate you're on this issue, wants that to happen in our country.
Thank you, Chief. I can't think of a better way to end this discussion. I do want to thank the audience, and we'll all have an opportunity to weigh in with questions. Right before we get to that, we'll be playing a short video. But I do want to thank you, Chief. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Ryan Baumberger and Ryan Anderson. If you haven't filled out your cards already, now would be a good time to fill out and ask questions, and you can do so while we're watching this video. As we're just waiting for the video to queue up, I'll keep the conversation going and just direct this question to Ryan Anderson. To your knowledge, how many people in America today are actually affected by SOGI law? This is a question from the audience.
Sure. So right now, roughly 50% of Americans live in jurisdictions that have a sexual orientation and gender identity statute. There isn't any federal SOGI, but enough of the largely populated states like California and New York, or some of the densely populated cities, have passed these SOGI laws. And that's where you see the cases of the baker, the florist, the photographer, the adoption agencies that have been forced to shut down. All of those individuals and institutions have been punished under state or local SOGI laws. And what they do is they say, if you believe we're created male and female, and that male and female are created for each other, and you then act on that belief, that's the functional equivalent, the legal equivalent of, quote, discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity.
You mentioned discrimination. What kind of discrimination do you think LGBT people are facing in this country?
So it's very hard to answer that question because there's been so little good empirical work done on those sorts of questions. It's largely based on self-reported surveys of have you experienced discrimination in your life. What we know as far as case studies is that when there was one pizza shop in the entire state of Indiana that when asked by a reporter, hypothetically, would you cater a same-sex wedding with pizza? And they said, no, we would sell pizza to our gay customers, but we wouldn't do a same-sex wedding. That store was boycotted and forced to shut down for several days as a result. And that was a hypothetical. So it strikes me if that sort of thing was going on a regular basis, we would be hearing about it, and yet we don't. And that may be one of the reasons why those robust empirical studies haven't been conducted.
Okay. Should the government play a role here if there is real bigotry towards LGBT people?
Yes, the role of the government here needs to be narrow and specified to what the need is. So we can't just take laws that were enacted in the 1960s to respond to racism and add the phrase sexual orientation and gender identity and expect the outcome to be good. What is discrimination on the basis of gender identity, for example? Right now, the ACLU is suing 2 Catholic hospitals because they won't do sex reassignment surgery. And the argument is that that's discrimination on the basis of gender identity. So if you're a hospital and you won't remove a woman's uterus who wants to become a man, that's now, according to the ACLU, unlawful discrimination. If you're a school and you won't let a 5-year-old boy use the girls' restroom, that's discrimination on the basis of gender identity. So it's much too sweeping to simply add that phrase "soji" to existing anti-discrimination laws. But if there is a particular need, we can have a particular public policy response. But we need to first know what is the need, and then we can tailor the response to the need. Right now, we're putting the cart before the horse. We're saying what the response is without ever getting clarity on what the need is.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. As a Muslim, I feel very strange about same-sex marriage. Should government make laws to discourage same-sex marriage? So this is a question from the audience. It says, as a Muslim, I feel very strange about same-sex marriage. Should government be making laws here? And I'll just open it up. Ryan, you can answer this, Baumberger, or Ryan Anderson, if you feel so led.
I can take it if not.
You can take it out. I'll add a few thoughts.
Sure. I mean, in general, we should have the positive law, the law that legislators make should reflect the natural law, and the natural law understanding of marriage that unites a man and a woman and a husband and a wife. So what we should have the law recognize, man-made law should recognize the natural law, which looks to human nature and what marriage is. And that marriage is based on 3 secular truths: an anthropological truth that men and women are distinct and complementary, biological fact that reproduction requires a man and a woman, and then a social reality that children deserve a mom and a dad. You put those 3 pieces together, you can have a basic understanding of what marriage is, and our man-made laws should reflect that. Apart from that, it's not clear to me why the government is in the consenting adult romance ratification business. That once we get away from the man, woman, husband, wife, mother, father understanding of what marriage is, I don't see what role the state has in regulating consenting adult sexual romantic relationships.
Baumberger said you wanted to add to that.
Well, yes. I mean, the problem is we have a 14th Amendment that is being used as a catch-all for everything. It was not created to give everyone the rights they feel that they deserve. I mean, it was specifically part of the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th. And so it is probably one of the most abused amendments. And I say that, I'll put that in the context of adoption and talk about how far sweeping some of these laws, these SOGI laws are. In the state of Illinois, for instance, if you're a foster parent who does not, if you're not LGBTQ, XYZ, I'm not sure how many letters you can add to it, but if you're not LGBTQ affirming, you are no longer eligible to be a foster parent. And who is that hurting? I mean, really, where's the discrimination targeted toward? It's certainly not LGBT individuals. It is the child who actually suffers in that case. And as in many cases where adoption agencies like Catholic Charities had to shut down. So people have to understand the far-reaching implications of this. And when it comes to discrimination, because it has become so arbitrary. I mean, how do you define discrimination? I mean, now we're looking at DC City Council, New York City Council, and now the state of California that are fining people for using the wrong pronoun when addressing an individual. Is that truly discrimination? I mean, especially when you're talking about, you know, the made-up 44 genders. I mean, is it really discrimination? And so you have to ask yourself, what does that even mean? Because we have a past throughout America where we see violent racial discrimination that is documented, that it is knowable. But today, the word discrimination is thrown about so much. What does it even mean? Are pronouns really hate speech? And so that's why, as someone who is an adoptee, someone who is an adoptive father, it really does deeply concern me, some of these local and state ordinances and laws that are being passed that in the end are actually hurting the most disenfranchised, the most vulnerable in our community.
Can I add one quick thing to that? When Ryan said that in the state of Illinois, unless you're LGBTQ affirming, you can't be a foster family or an adoptive parent, I just want to specify what that looks like. Unless you are willing to place your 9-year-old daughter on puberty blockers, You are not allowed to be a foster parent or an adoptive parent in the state of Illinois. That's what LGBTQ affirming in that context looks like. So unless you're willing to say that if my child has gender dysphoria, we will place the child on puberty blockers and then at age 16 administer cross-sex hormones, you're ineligible to care for children. That's how crazy the state of affairs are.
Kelly, I'll direct this question to you on behalf of the chief. What is the legal status of the chief's case?
That's a great question. So after he was wrongfully terminated in 2014, we filed a federal civil rights lawsuit on his behalf, claiming both wrongful termination and violation of his constitutional rights. We'll be arguing cross motions for summary judgment on November 17th before a federal district court in Georgia, asking for the judge to do the right thing in his case and not only restore to restore his constitutional freedoms, to be able to work and not to be fired based on his viewpoints.
I'll just ask you a parallel question to the Jack Phillips case. What happens if Jack Phillips, in fact, loses this case?
Well, it somewhat depends on how the court ultimately rules and in what way, how narrow or broad that the loss is. But I think at a very fundamental level, what that means is something that all of us, all Americans, regardless of our viewpoints on same-sex marriage, should be very frightened about. Because what it ultimately will mean and will say is that the government can come in and dictate to us and compel to Americans the types of creative arts that they can be a part of. So whether you're a painter or whether you're a photographer, whether you're a graphic designer, the government can come in and say, we don't like these certain beliefs, and we're going to force you to create that, even if it's against your conscience. And regardless of where we fall on these issues, that should be really frightening for all of us, because in America, we have that amazing freedom to live consistent. We should have that ability. We have for so many years to all get along, both majority and minority viewpoints. So I think that's really what's at stake here. And there's a lot to lose that all of us should care deeply about. Even I think the good way of saying it is, even if you support same-sex marriage, you should still absolutely support Jack, and you should hope that he wins.
Absolutely. How does the religious liberty that you just mentioned, how does that benefit everyone, even non-religious citizens? It's a general understanding of it applying to everyone. How would it affect or benefit both non-religious and religious citizens?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question, because the First Amendment, religious freedom, free speech, it benefits all of us, the religious, the non-religious. And if you look at other countries that have decreased their protections for religious freedom, look at how their economies are doing. Do they have free speech? Do they have freedom of the press? How do they treat minorities? Freedom, civil liberties absolutely travel together, and when one is infringed upon or when one is taken away, ultimately we'll see every other one crumble. So it's a very important thing to care about when religious freedom or free speech is being attacked, because a lot of liberties will fall behind that.
Thank you. Will you all join me in thanking our panelists, Chief Cochran, Kelly Fedoric, Ryan Baumberger, and Ryan Anderson.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you very much for coming to Heritage today.